Welcome again to Off the Page. I'm Leslie Choice, and my guest today is Pamela Wallin, Canadian broadcast journalist, also author of a new book called Since You Asked. Hi, welcome to be.
Hi, good to be here.
Good to have you on the show. In the introduction to your book, you say, "I am a runner," and I know you're not talking about being out there jogging down the street.
No,
what do you
that's
mean?
right. I'm certainly not that.
Yeah.
Running is really, I guess, just part of the journalistic world. I mean, you are always chasing a story. I have worked in daily news all my life in one form or another. Morning programs, newspapers, nightly news, daily television shows. So you really do feel like you're constantly, running after that story, chasing that fact, chasing that bit of information. I guess part of the problem with that is that you never slow down long enough to think about what you still think. I mean, do you still hold the beliefs and the ideas and the values that you always thought you have along the way? Have enough things, sort of hit up against you, of those waves sort of lapping at the shore, really changed your mind about things? So this was an opportunity to really look back at that, to stop and see whether I could sort out some truths from all those facts and bits of information.
So the book allowed you to stop running, however briefly.
Well, although I had to continue to work while I was doing that. But I'm an insomniac, so it meant I could write the book when I got home at 10:30 at night or 11 when everybody else sensibly has gone to bed. I could sit there until 2 o'clock, because that's my evening when the program is over. I'm still up, I'm still functioning, so I use that time.
How many hours a day can you get by with sleep?
Well, I sleep probably about 4 hours, unless I'm in hotel rooms, and then it's 2.
That's quite incredible. You can do that. You say in your book that you're at midpoint in career, and I kind of wonder, how do you know that? How do you know this is the middle?
No, it's wishful thinking in that sense. No, I think what happened was really I went off to this dinner for Peter Lougheed, who's the former Premier of Alberta. He was getting an award, and the host of the dinner asked me to get up and say a few things about the first time I'd met Peter. And so you start thinking back, what year was that? What had occurred? When was the last federal election? And you do realize that the future is now shorter than the past, right? That you're in fact past midpoint. Although technically, I guess women these days are supposed to live until we're 90. That's what the statistics say. And we may very well be working until we're 90 in the new world too. So I thought there's no sense waiting until we come to some artificial end to look back. Let's look at a work in progress and see if we can learn anything from what we've been doing all these years.
And here you are, work in progress. Now, it's funny, you do talk about the 1950s, born in 1953. It's right there in the book, so I can say that. Were there big cultural influences, mindset kind of influences that came out of the 50s that somehow shaped the person that you are?
Well, I do think that. I mean, you never know that at the time, obviously. It's only when you go back in retrospect and look. I grew up in this small town, which was, for all intents and purposes, leave it to beaverish. We would run down to the store to get a quart of milk for Mom, and if Mom forgot something, she'd call, Bob or Mary down at the store and say, "Now, can you tell Pam to bring home a loaf of bread as well?" Whatever it is. We did really live and operate in this cloak of security, which only in looking back upon it do I realize allowed me to develop a real sense of self-confidence. If you are, as a kid, allowed to go places, to confront situations, to experiment, to explore, then you have the confidence to do that. If you're raising a kid in an urban center these days, you're using the word no a lot. Don't go there, don't talk to that person, don't speak to strangers, don't ask questions, don't go behind that door. And it has, what I'm fearful about is that it kind of stifles that natural curiosity that we have. I was allowed to let that, to let that go. And I think it did give me a view on the world and an approach to the world that's allowed me to do what I've done in my life.
And obviously a strength. And of course, this was the town that you called the center of the universe.
The real center of the universe, as opposed to the self-declared center of the universe, which is Toronto and Ottawa and Montreal.
Wadena, Saskatchewan. Population, whatever.
About 1,500.
Now?
Yeah.
And
it's about
more or less the same as back then?
Yeah.
You were talking about the urbanization problem there, and I had pulled a quote out of the book where you had written, "Urbanization is creating a kind of social amnesia where no one is anyone's keeper."
Yeah. That's what troubles me about where I live, and it was one of the things I explored in the process of writing this book. I go back to my hometown a lot. My family's there, my mom, my dad, my sister, her husband,
Heck,
her
they
kids.
named the street after you there.
They named the street after me.
Yeah.
I have to go and drive down Pamela Wallin Drive. But I do find that, I mean, there are no homeless in a place like Wadena when this is a huge issue right across the country. And the reason there are no homeless is because everybody belongs to somebody. And we lose that. And I'm not trying to be Pollyanna here and to be totally naive about let's all go, you know, back to the days of the horse and buggy and, you know, if we all just have one big group hug, it'll be fine. I don't mean that. But we do have to bring some of that sensibility back into the lives that we have in these hectic, you know, on the run urban lifestyles. We have to find some sense of community. In part, it's because we're dealing with a global economy, and the answers to a lot of questions we now get from our politicians are, we can't do anything about that. It's the global economy. It's the way things are. Partly that's true, but partly there are ways for all of us to deal with our lives, I think, through our community. And we can define that in different ways. I mean, the internet is redefining community too.
But can you do that with television? Does television have anything to do with community, or
Yes,
is television
I do.
destroying community?
Well, it's both. I mean, television is one of those instruments, like any piece of technology, that creates isolation. It can. I mean, you can watch television all by yourself, you and your channel changer. You can get on the internet and stay there for days, weeks, hours, months if you want. That is, you know, that is one of the courses. I think if those of us who work in the business, encourage people and are part of the process of making people literate viewers and more critical spectators of this medium, that it has a chance to become an important force. Television has changed. It used to be a very passive instrument. You would sit in front of it, you would watch whatever it is that channel told you to watch, because you only had one or two choices. In a world where there's 50 or 60 or 70 channels, or 100 or 500, you have all sorts of choices, and it puts a lot more responsibility on your shoulders to make those choices. For those of us who work inside the business, I think it's my responsibility to engage with you in demystifying the process, talking about the technology, talking about the benefits, because your high standards, not you, but the viewer at large, the viewer's high standards help ensure ours. This is a responsive medium. People don't watch, you don't exist. So you have to establish that relationship with people.
Okay, you're talking about a kind of responsibility, and I want to take you back again, not all the way to 1953, but 1970, the Kent State shootings. Something happened then or around then that began to shape the person that you are?
Well, it was the days of student activism. I grew up believing I was going to be a French teacher, which was a mission in itself. I mean, I guess I've always been on a little bit of a mission. And this was not a most obvious selection growing up in Saskatchewan, but I found it very intriguing. Went to university, still very much had that intention. But as I got involved in the student newspaper and the Women's Center and student politics, it starts to broaden your horizons a little bit. You look at something like that. You look, because that wasn't true in my own world, but you look at kids your own age being shot. And it has a profound effect on you, even though it's not you. I mean,
what is that profound effect?
Well,
it said to you, something's happening out there.
It said that there is change. There are things that that I don't like about this world. There is an active role for the citizen to play, which is why I think journalism is so important, because if you don't have informed citizens, you don't have democracy. So, you know, but I didn't understand that connection at that point. All I know is that the television screen brought me those images.
Yes.
I was allowed to see through the screen a world that I didn't know, but could very easily have touched me there, but for the grace of God, you know, do we all go? And it hit me that, you know, we have to take that on. We have to take on, if you don't like what you see on the television screen, you know, it's not good enough just to shut it off or change the channel. If you don't like that picture that's being reflected back, then maybe there's something wrong with the picture. Maybe there's something wrong with the world, and maybe you should take a role in changing that if you don't like about it, not just sitting back and saying, I'm going to put my head in the sand. Change the channel.
Is this where the social worker in you was coming from? I mean, here you said you pumped gas, you sold encyclopedias, right. You were a waitress, social worker, and you end up working at a penitentiary for your first job?
Yes, I did. I
Wow.
mean, that was, I think, part of the the activism led me away from teaching French and into political science and sociology and psychology. And I guess I've always been interested in the why people do things. It's interesting what they do, and it's interesting how they do it. That's all part of the world and even of the journalistic world. But the why has always intrigued me more. So I think that's why the tug and pull towards psychology, in that sense, getting inside people's heads, which is now what I do for a living as well. It's not fundamentally different than being the practicing psychologist.
What was it like there at the penitentiary, though? What were you doing?
Well,
counseling people?
I started out working, it was through a government agency, and I was working with Native women on the outside in Prince Albert, which is a town in the sort of the northern part of the province. A very, very high Native population, and inside the jail, you know, almost exclusively. I mean, the numbers are extraordinary in terms of the Native to white ratio. And so if you're going to work with the wives on the outside, it made no sense to only deal with half of the equation. So part of it was getting inside, dealing with the men, trying to do something real in the sense of getting them involved in projects which would not put money in their pockets, because that's against the law or against the rules if you're a prisoner, but to at least allow them vicariously to make some contribution to the family, which kept the family connection with them and their connection with the family, because that's what leads to the breakdown. I mean, if a guy's facing 10 or 15 or 20 years in there, it's pretty hard to keep that connection. And making a real contribution to the family in financial terms in most men's minds is at least real.
And that must have been a big challenge, though. Here you are, you're sort of a
yeah.
college girl.
The
coming out
college
of
girl
small
comes
town.
to the prison.
Yeah,
and
going
the
to do good
prison
deeds.
warden sort of looks and says, oh yeah, this is a really good idea. Guys
yeah.
who've been locked up for 20 years, I think I'm going to put you in there.
Yeah, that's right. Go in there, see what happens.
But of course I thought he was wrong and I was right. Eventually there is some medium ground, and I must say I never had a single problem inside, and I think that's because guys who are inside prisons understand how much they have to lose. And this was a connection with the outside world and a connection with their families. Why blow it? Why do something stupid? And so I never had a minute's trouble. But you can understand, or at least I can now understand, the warden's concern. I mean, I was a hostage incident waiting to occur.
Yeah,
you know?
well, maybe I'm beginning to see the connection between that and the person that you were then, and sort of the woman going where no woman has gone before in journalism. What's the thread that went from one to the next?
Well, I guess I was lucky in the sense that I grew up with a mother who was a role model before that was a phrase. She was a working woman, always earned more than my father, was very, very active in her community. So I just, as a kid growing up, assumed that women worked, made money, made decisions, had families, carried on work in the community, held a job. I mean, there was just never any question. So I came to a lot of these issues with, again, that self-confidence, that question of, well, why is it that you think I couldn't do this? You know, as opposed to, oh, I can't do this, please let me.
Yes.
You know, my attitude was always very, very different. So I didn't go out with some, I mean, I wasn't on a mission that I was going to be the first woman, this, that, or the other thing. It's just because I was curious and aggressive and liked to try things, I ended up sometimes being the first woman doing a lot of these things. So, you know, I guess you see the mission part of it afterwards, not at the time necessarily.
Right. Okay, we're going to take a short break right now, and we'll be back speaking with Pamela Wallin right after this. My guest today is Pamela Wallin. What's the most dangerous place you've ever gone to as a journalist?
I suppose in some ways the war in Argentina, I mean, we were never on the Falkland Islands, nor was I in the ocean.
But you were in the streets.
But we were in the streets, and the reason it was dangerous there is because, A, the country was run by military thugs. There were a lot of freelance groups operating who could take you at whim. One of the stories we covered, in addition to the war itself, was the mothers of the disappeared, this group of women who marched every day around the Plaza de Mayo where, in protest because their children, who had been politically active or maybe not, had simply disappeared in the back seat of a Ford Falcon, which is the car that this kind of secret service organization was infamous for, with their plates tipped back so that you couldn't read the license plate. It was a country where you didn't have any rights. And so, and because they were new to this, it was perhaps the most fearful. If you go into a place like Central America, where they've been in a perpetual state of civil war for many, many years, it's a matter of course. They're used to having correspondence there. It's kind of, do you want to go out with the guerrillas? You know, do you want to go out with the government side? I mean, you could almost pick your story in that sense. In a place where you've got, you know, 14-year-olds on the corner with AK-47s because the real soldiers have gone off to war, that's a dangerous situation where there's no court of appeal, where they don't care whether the world's eyes have turned on them. So how did you feel?
Were you scared?
Yes, I was scared, although I was traveling, working with the cameraman, who subsequently became my husband, was a very experienced war zone cameraman. So he, you know, I felt confident with him, and he sort of taught me a lot of the tricks of the trade on the way. You know, we got caught up in a very, very nasty riot one night, and I was dressed to go out and do a report, basically, on, you know, one of the military leaders was going to give a speech, and we were going to do a stand-up. So I was dressed, had on a dress, not high heels, but, you know, shoes with heels on them. And, you know, when the tear gas started flying, I mean, Malcolm just said, "Get the shoes off now," right? Because we're going to be running, right? Yeah. Those kinds of things. So, you know, but we did get stopped, and we were detained and held for 3 or 4 hours at one point. And my tendency, of course, because I was a little naive in those situations, was to say, you know, don't you understand? I mean, we're journalists here. This is freedom of speech is involved. And Malcolm's view was, keep your mouth shut. You know, if you don't provoke them, if they don't see that they are having the effect on us that they want to have, which was to either make us angry or to make us scared, the amusement factor will probably wane quickly, and they'll let us go. He was right, I was wrong. So I learned the lesson.
Did you come back changed in any other ways other than learning a few tricks of the trade?
Yeah, I came back changed fundamentally, not only about my view of journalism and television in particular, but my view of my own country. I'd always thought Canada was a great and interesting place. And I had spent many hours, days, weeks, months covering constitutional stories with earnestness and the importance of all of that. When you go to a place where people are fighting for the right to live and are dealing with no basic freedoms as they were at that point in a country ruled by a military junta, you come back and you say, we don't actually appreciate how fortunate we are. Here we are dancing on the head of this constitutional pin, deciding, you know, which phrase and which paragraph we want. We sometimes forget to stop and realize that that is a luxury. That is a luxury of democracy, of freedom, of peace. And, you know, every once in a while I think people need a good shake so that you come back and say, we're very lucky that we can have these conversations about whether or not Quebec should separate or whether we should have a social union or whatever the issue of the day is. We're able to have that because we've got a democracy.
Right. And speaking of conversations, you've had many conversations interviewing many, many people, including prime ministers. Your favorite prime minister interview was?
Well, actually, it was certainly not the one that I shone in. It was the one that I learned my most basic lesson about television when I was very new. Went off to do an interview with Pierre Trudeau. And he was at about 20% in the polls at that point. So with that cockiness that inexperience inspires, I sort of walked into the room and said, well, surely, Prime Minister, if you're at 20% in the polls, you have lost the moral authority to govern. Don't you think you should resign?
He wouldn't have liked that very much, I wouldn't think.
Well, no, because it was a stupid question. And he proceeded to point that out to me, which by, you know, humiliating me, saying, now that's a very interesting theory of democracy, Ms. Wallin. Does that mean if I were at 40% in the polls, I could simply suspend elections and not bother with any of this anymore? And of course, he was absolutely right, that that was the logical extension of what I was asking him. So I walked away from that one bruised but smarter. because I just learned not to ask a question like that. You got to think through what the consequences are, you know, so that you A, don't humiliate yourself on national television, but B, you have a more interesting exchange for the viewer to watch.
Good advice, and I'm learning here as we talk. And you had some advice for people like me in the book. You say, for example, a bad interview is like a bad blind date. You want to elaborate on that?
Well, I was stretching. I was looking for some kind of explanation, analogy here, and it is kind of one of those things, and you see it in all the dating manuals, you know, that you should always agree when you're going out on a blind date only to go for coffee, not for dinner, because if things are going well, you can always turn it into dinner. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But if you've already committed to dinner, you know, how the hell do you get out of this if it's going really badly? And that's kind of the same thing. I mean, you kind of wish that when you're halfway into some of these things, you know, that it had only been coffee, that it was only a 5-minute interview,
do you care to
not the hour.
A truly unnerving interview that you've had?
Well, I've never had any that are unnerving, but I've had some that were unpleasant. And the one that disappointed me absolutely the most was Carl Bernstein. This is one half of the Woodward-Bernstein duo. Right. Of Watergate fame.
And Deep Throat and all that.
And Deep Throat. Mm-hmm. I mean, they changed fundamentally politics in the United States and certainly journalism worldwide. No question about that. I don't think it's an overstatement. They were doing their work when I was just getting into this business. These guys were the greats. They were the heroes. Mm-hmm. So Carl Bernstein is coming through town. He's written a book on Ronald Reagan, the Pope, and the fall of the Berlin Wall, which I thought was kind of an odd book, but nevertheless, I was very keen to talk with him and meet him, see what he was like. And I always spend time with people in the green room before the interview begins. You've got to have a point of connection. You know, you want to be able to relate to them on some level. Went in, said to him, you know, I'd like to talk a little bit about Watergate just before we get to the book. Don't worry, we'll talk about the book. And he just looked at me, you know, sort of contemptuously and said, yeah, save it for the studio, honey. And I just, like, in a
didn't
flash.
Smack you in the face, huh?
I didn't. In a flash, you know, like 20 years sort of went in, you know, gone of sort of believing in these guys and thinking. Now, Woodward, I think, is a different story. His career's continued. I think part of the problem with Carl Bernstein is that his career kind of fell apart. You know, Watergate was the highlight, and it's been downhill from then, which was an interesting part of the story. You know, I mean, you have to understand that whole thing about context. It's so crucial to journalism. You know, you got to understand the circumstances in which people operate. So, you know, you do not go in to beat up on somebody like that because things haven't worked out all that well for him. But I was just so hugely disappointed. Yeah.
Okay, we're going to take another short break and come back and say goodbye to Pamela Wallin right after this. Welcome back. My guest today has been Pamela Wallin. Pamela, we all have these sort of epiphanic moments in our life, and you've revealed a few, but could you give me one point in your life where something really changed?
Well, I mean, I suppose losing your job in front of the country, you know, on national television was one of those moments of epiphany for me in that sense. But it's turned out to be the best possible thing. Sometimes you don't take yourself to the end of the dock, jump in the water and see if you can swim. Sometimes you need to be pushed. You'll learn a lot about yourself in that situation. Glad I had the experience.
And you were pushed? But here you are.
I was pushed, definitely pushed, but I'm back alive and well and practicing journalism that I can really be proud of.
Thanks for being on the show.
My pleasure.
And thanks for watching Off the Page. See you again next time.